When it comes to naval history in general, and specific naval operations in particular, logistics are very often overlooked, especially in the more popular histories. In some ways this is understandable. It's very exciting to read about lots of flashes and bangs and big explosions, and it's perhaps not so exciting to read about the 15th trip of a fast oiler trudging back and forth from Pearl Harbor, picking up fuel to make sure that the ships can stay active, especially when nothing actually goes horribly wrong. But at the same time, without logistics, those big exciting battles very rarely, if ever, occur. So let's have a quick look at the logistical supply chain involved in keeping a navy floating, fighting, and of course, if you're the crew, fed. But before we get completely stuck in, believe it or not, we've managed to pick up a sponsor for one of this month's videos. So this video has been kindly sponsored by Audible. They've obviously decided that it's worth sponsoring the channel a second time, so that's always good and welcome. And as you can see on screen, they are a purveyor of audiobooks as well as many other things, and there are a number of titles that will take your interest. You can search naval history, naval warfare, naval battles, military, etc., and you'll find quite the wide range of books to take your interest. And you can find just below each title, you'll see there's a little thing that says sample, so you can listen to a little bit of the narration and work out if you like the voice, because after all, if you're going to listen to 8, 10, 12 hours plus of narration, you want to make sure that you enjoy the person who's speaking to you. Unfortunately, I have not as yet got a contract as an Audible narrator, so you won't find me on there just for the minute. But you can see there are a number of different titles available, covering all sorts of wide-ranging subjects. If you're not an Audible member already, then you can get a free audiobook by visiting audible.com/Drakinifel or texting Drakinifel to 500 500. That bit never gets old for some reason. And that'll give you a free credit to use for any audiobook you like. You can keep that whatever, whether you choose to continue with your subscription or not. But if you do choose to continue with your subscription, you can subscribe for a variety of different levels. You can get 1 credit a month, 2 credits a month, use those credits to redeem against audiobooks. And there's also apparently now a thing called Audible Plus, where you can engage with a even deeper catalogue of audiobooks, podcasts, etc., etc. So check it out if you like, and thank you once again to Audible for sponsoring this week's video. And now back to logistics. Broadly speaking, the kinds of things that logistical trains will bring to a fleet can be divided into 4 broad categories. Food, fuel, which is kind of technically the same thing, only for the crew and for the ship respectively, ammunition and other ordnance, and spare parts. The first thing that any navy has to worry about when it comes to any of these categories, or the various subcategories that you can divide those down into, is where are they coming from? What is the source of these components? And that can actually be a significantly more complex issue than you might otherwise think. Because whilst hopefully most countries do grow at least some of their own food, fuel, especially as you move into the 20th century, can be a much more complex issue. Not just whether or not you have it, but whether your local sources are large enough or indeed high quality enough for the use of your navy. Generally speaking, if you're a medium to large size navy, you will be manufacturing your own ammunition, but if you're a smaller navy, or perhaps a smaller navy that's growing to a medium-sized navy and has ambitions, you might not actually be manufacturing some of the larger pieces of ammunition yourself. And when it comes to spare parts, again, depending on what those spare parts are for, the technology base might be overseas, and this will dictate some of your logistical constraints. Now, what do I mean by all of that? Well, let's take it in reverse order. Let's look at spares, for example. During the Industrial Revolution, the steam engine and then the double expansion steam engine and then the triple expansion steam engine were eventually supplanted by the turbine, and in some navies later on by the diesel engine, at least in the period that we're looking at. We won't particularly look at gas turbines and such because they fall really mostly after the 1950s. And that's saying nothing about nuclear power plants, which again are a whole separate issue in and of themselves. And whilst there are many other spare parts required to keep a warship running, everything from light bulbs, electrical cabling, turret bearings, gears, motors, portholes, lenses, and such like, machinery is a good case to look at to illustrate the whole. Now, before the invention of the steam engine, the machinery, if you like, the method of propulsion was, of course, generally sails, which are supported by masts and yards. Now, whilst this isn't anywhere near as complicated as a steam engine, it still does have logistical concerns. Masts are obviously very tall, and ideally you generally want a single piece mast. That is, a mast that is made of the trunk of a tree, rather than a composite mast which is made of a bunch of planks or smaller trunks planed and bound together, usually by iron bands. There are some minor advantages to composite masts, but generally speaking, navies would prefer a single mast. However, obviously to do that you need to have a country where the forests grow very tall, very straight tree trunks. And generally you actually tend to find that the kind of tree species that grow in that manner are very different to the kind of tree species that will grow things like, say, wood suitable for keels, ribbing, framing, and planking. And so in a country like, say, England, in the Age of Sail, there were plenty of oak forests, and if they were carefully managed, these could be kept growing and kept resupplied. And this would be great for your hulls, but the kind of spruce, fir, and if you were a bit of a short stop, pine, that was needed to produce the masts didn't grow quite as much or as well in England. So a lot of that would come from initially the Baltic, then later on America, and then once the Americans had decided they wanted to go their own way, back to the Baltic again. So the source of a lot of masts for the Royal Navy was actually overseas, and this posed something of a problem when the Royal Navy and the UK as a whole, or England, depending on what time period you're looking at, ended up at war with one or more people who either normally supplied those components or could interdict the supply of those components. Indeed, entire sub-theatres of the various 18th century naval campaigns were fought mainly to secure supplies of this kind for the Royal Navy. Obviously, if you happen to be a country the size of something like America, where you have multiple different environmental zones, it's not quite as bad, because different types of tree will grow in different types of climate, and if they're all in the same country, well, you can harvest them all and put together a ship from the Age of Sail using just local materials, although transporting it everywhere is something of a bother. Nevertheless, once you get into the age of steam, initially you have to look at, well, does my country actually possess the technology to make steam engines in the first place? And in the early part of the steam era, that wasn't necessarily a given. As the Industrial Revolution spread, it then became a case of, am I able to manufacture steam engines of the requisite power and the requisite, relatively speaking, miniaturization? Because if you go and have a look at some of the earliest steam engines, the kinds that we used to extract water from mines, they're not especially powerful, and they are absolutely colossal. So they wouldn't fit on a ship, and even if you built a ship big enough to fit them, they really wouldn't help you go anywhere fast, or at all. So this was a concern for a lot of nations, and this affected the take-up of steam power, for reasons that we'll go on to explain a little bit further. But going through history as things went further on, and everyone had kind of gotten the hang of building vertical triple expansion engines, at least, again, for the major and medium-sized naval powers, then things moved on to turbines. And once again, it was a case of, do we actually have the capacity in our own country to manufacture turbines, and then later geared turbines? And if not, well, do we risk importing them? And this is what it comes down to when you're talking about the source for your spare parts, and indeed the original machinery itself. Whether it's in the Age of Sail and you're looking at masts, the early steam period when you're looking at single, double and triple expansion engines, or the early part of the 20th century when you're looking at turbines, it's a calculated risk. If you do not possess the ability to manufacture this machinery or the spare parts yourself, then you are going to be at a disadvantage one way or the other. Either you don't take that technology up until your own local industrial base can supply it, in which case the ships that you're building at the time will be technologically inferior to the ships of your enemy or potential enemy, and then you have to decide whether that disadvantage is significant enough that you can live with it or not. And if you can't live with it, you're faced with importing the technology. Now, importing the technology in peacetime is fine, especially if it's from a third party, i.e. someone that you don't particularly think you're going to be fighting. Even better yet, an ally. But all these things can change in war. Someone who's an ally might turn out to be an enemy. Someone who is still happy to supply you might be cut off by someone else who really doesn't want them to supply you. And if that happens, then you might have ships that you've built that are now technologically on a par with the people you're fighting, but are going to break down in a few months' time because you have no ability to provide for the maintenance and upkeep of those particular bits of technology. One of the best microcosms of this is the adoption of turbine technology. When you look at the mid to late 1900s, you see that Britain, which at the time was leading in turbine technology, put turbines on HMS Dreadnought. And they thought, this is fine. We have Parsons within the country. They're the ones who have pretty much originated the turbine. We can manufacture it. This is great. Everybody gets turbines on all our capital ships. This is fantastic. However, just across the Channel-North Sea, Germany, which at the time was in the middle of a building race with the United Kingdom, took one look at it all and went, yep, these would be very, very, very nice. However, one, the British are likely to charge us an absolute fortune to get the turbine technology over here. And two, whether or not they're on our side, against us, or neutral, getting the supplies over will, A, in peacetime cost us a fair bit, because Parsons will definitely look to profit from it, and B, in wartime, we have no idea whether or not we'll be able to maintain that supply line. And as a result, you got things like the Nassaus and the Helgolands. That weird hexagonal layout was not necessarily their first choice when it came to big gun layout, since it required them to have 6 turrets and 12 guns for a mere 8-gun broadside. But the sheer size of vertical triple expansion engines, especially with a clue in the first part vertical, meant that there simply wasn't the space amidships to put centerline turrets anywhere other than the extreme fore and aft ends of the ship, whereas on HMS Dreadnought, because of the more compact nature of the turbine engines, it was possible to put more guns on the centerline, and the wing turrets were there mainly because Fisher was obsessed with end on fire because he thought he'd be chasing everybody down. There was, of course, an alternate solution to this, which was superfiring turrets, as seen on the South Carolina, which combined the superfiring turret, which saved space and therefore allowed all the guns to be on the centerline with vertical triple expansion engines, but that has compromises in and of itself, and the Germans would rather have all their guns on the same plane. When it comes to ammunition, as we said, most of the time you would be manufacturing your ammunition of all of the various logistical issues. Sourcing your ammunition is pretty much the most likely, at least for a major or medium-sized navy, to be something that you can do yourself, because usually you're using your own guns. However, it's not necessarily the case for all navies, because smaller navies, especially ones that are ordering entire ships with their armament from overseas, are usually doing so because they don't have the industry themselves. Now, to a certain extent, you can overcome this issue by stockpiling ammunition in peacetime and just hoping - relying on the fact that if you have, let's say, 10 full loads of ammunition for each of your ships, the chances of any war you might get involved in going on for so long that the ships expend all of that ammunition and you're unable to, for any reason, to resupply at all, is a relatively unlikely circumstance. But it's still a risk that you run, especially when you're importing ammunition that may or may not degrade somewhat over time, either just due to its nature or due to the fact you might not have exactly perfect storage facilities. But even if you can manufacture and store your own ammunition, there is one further issue that you have to account for, and that is how many types of ammunition do you have? This was something that really came to a head toward the end of the 19th century with the pre-dreadnought era getting into real full swing, because you could have a battleship that might have 4, 5, or even 6 different kinds of gun. And especially in the latter part of the 19th century, when ships were being built in 1s and 2s, you might have a battleship that has 5 or 6 different kinds of gun, and you might have its successor class, which also has 5 or 6 different kinds of gun, but many of those guns will be completely different to the guns that are on the previous ship. There's no real standardization. When, for example, the Victoria class were being constructed, one of the main complaints that came in from admirals in the Mediterranean fleet was that between the Benbow or Admiral class, the Victoria class, and various other classes that were being sent to the Mediterranean fleet, they were having to maintain stockpiles of 2 or 3 dozen different kinds of ammunition, some of which were annoyingly very similar in size, which meant that it was very difficult to ensure that each ship had its full and correct load of ammunition, because if you sent out, say, a shipment of 4-inch shells, and it turned out that, well, that fit the guns on one ship, but another ship had 4.5-inch or 4.7-inch tertiary guns, then that ammunition load was completely useless for them. And that's just the capital ships. That's before you get the armoured cruisers involved, and that's just for tertiary guns. So if you were looking at secondary gun ammunition, and the Admiral of the Fleet said, well, we want some secondary gun ammunition out here, well, does he mean 6-inch ammunition? Does he mean 7.5-inch ammunition? Does he mean 9.2-inch ammunition? And if those annoying second-class battleships that we bought to stop the Chilean-Argentinian arms race potting up, does that mean we have to also send out 10-inch ammunition for their main guns? And even when you're looking at primary armament, the main battery, which you might think, well, surely there's some standardization there. Well, are you bringing in 12-inch shells? Are you bringing in 13.5-inch shells? Are you bringing in 16.25-inch shells? And if you are bringing the 13.5 or 12-inch shells, are you bringing them in for the newer longer barrel guns? Are you bringing them in for the shorter barrel guns? Are you bringing in shot? Which might only be able to be fired from the earlier guns? Are you bringing in the new armor-piercing shells that can be fired from the longer guns but not the shorter guns? And so on, and so on, and so forth. So just because you can manufacture your own ammunition doesn't necessarily mean that your logistical issues are solved by that. Standardization is very important, and this is why later on in the 20th century, you tended to find that one of the reasons that navies quite often would resist jumping up to the next big caliber of gun on the battleships was because they didn't want to have to complicate their supply line quite as much. If you went with every single possible iteration and adaptation of battleship gun caliber, you could very quickly end up just with the main batteries trying to supply 4 or 5 different kinds of ammunition. Whereas if you look at, say, the US Navy by the Second World War, unless they were having to send a few bits of legacy ammo out to the Arkansas, they effectively just had to supply 14-inch and 16-inch ammunition. The Royal Navy had to supply 15-inch and 16-inch ammunition through most of the interwar period. Then the King George V showed up and they had to supply 14-inch ammunition as well. And when the French were looking at the successor for the Richelieu class, one of the main reasons they selected the 15-inch gun, just more of them in the successor theoretically named Alsace class, was because with the Britannias and the Dunkirks and the Richelieus, they were also still in a position of having to supply 3 different kinds of ammunition, and if they'd gone with 16-inch guns, they would have had to supply 4. Secondary guns, even by World War II, could be almost as much of a mess. The US really lucked out, or possibly very, very cleverly by design, had standardized on the 5-inch gun, so you just had to supply 5-inch ammunition to absolutely everything. Whereas in the Royal Navy, things were not perhaps quite so bright, because you had to supply 4-inch, 4.5-inch, 4.7-inch, 5.25-inch, and until Hood's secondary battery was replaced with 4-inch AA guns, 5.5-inch ammunition to various ships, which really didn't help things. There were, of course, also 6-inch secondary guns on some battleships, but this was somewhat mitigated by the fact that a lot of light cruisers were obviously using 6-inch guns as well, so that supply chain was already well in place. Fuel, of course, was not a particular major concern during the Age of Sail, but during the Age of Steam, iron and steel, it did become something of a problem. This took into account two fuels, coal and then later oil. With coal, it was a matter of, well, did your country have coal deposits in the first place? If so, great. And to be fair, most countries at least had some. The second issue was the quality. This would show up quite considerably during World War I with the High Seas Fleet, whose ships' theoretical performance, when using very good quality anthracite coal, was somewhat undermined by the fact that Germany's naturally occurring bituminous coal was nowhere near as calorific, i.e. had as much energy per unit, and also had this annoying tendency of clogging up the grates very quickly, to the point that after less than 24 hours steaming, you could have destroyers tootling around at a maximum speed less than that of a pre-dreadnought battleship, simply because not enough of their boilers were either working or were needing to be cleaned. But at least the High Seas Fleet could still move around. Once you got into the era of oil firing, it turned out that unless you were the United States, oil and nations that had major navies didn't really go together. You had to find your oil from elsewhere. There were some fields in Europe, but they weren't controlled by France or Germany when they stayed within their national borders. But by far the biggest suppliers of oil for the early part of the 20th century were the United States, the Middle East, and to a lesser extent the Dutch East Indies. Now, whilst like ammunition, you could stockpile oil, and, well, in the early eras you could also stockpile high-quality coal, it was, like ammunition, a consumable resource, but unlike ammunition, you didn't have an option as to whether or not to use it when your ship set sail. If your ship went to sea, it would be burning fuel. If you were then sailing around and you didn't find anybody to shoot at, then you'd come back with your ammunition load on board and your ammunition would be conserved. But the coal or oil that you burned was gone forever, and as ships got bigger and faster, they needed a lot more fuel. And if you ran out of fuel, your ships weren't going anywhere, which led, especially in World War II, to a number of navies, mainly Axis ones, having to curtail their operations quite significantly due to the simple fact that if they conducted operations on the kind of tempo that they'd want to, they would be flat out of bunker fuel in a few months, at which point their fleet was going nowhere and was effectively at that point some very pretty, if slightly sinky, shore defences. The last thing to consider is food, but whilst this may sound fairly simple, as of course everybody grows food, there are still, believe it or not, restrictions on this when it comes to the source. Obviously, fancy foods that might grow elsewhere would be somewhat short on the menu in times of war, but that's less of a concern as to whether or not you've physically got enough food in the first place. Again, in the times of the Age of Sail, the population levels of most countries were small enough that these kinds of issues about running out of food weren't really that much of a concern. But by the time you got to the Age of Steam and Steel, particularly in the 20th century, an awful lot of nations imported food because they didn't grow enough food themselves, or if they could, perhaps the level of food that they could grow was just on the edge, and so, let's say, depriving farms of a lot of skilled workers because they've all been conscripted into the army, and or a couple of bad harvests caused by the weather, could push your food supply below the level that you actually needed to sustain your population. Now, of course, your military is the key, hopefully, to winning the war, so you wouldn't shortchange your soldiers and sailors of food as a first resort. But the simple fact of the matter is that, one, being in the armed forces on wartime duty is a very, very high calorie consumption activity, and two, if you start reducing the amount of rations or indeed making them all tasteless and bland, the morale of your troops might go down. So if your troops don't have all that much energy and they're being fed effectively bland gruel all the time, they might start to resent you somewhat, which is never good if you're an officer and you like staying alive, or if you're the high command and you want troops to actually follow your orders when you tell them to attack something. Of course, if you don't have a choice in this matter because you need or want a very large military and you can't necessarily supply them all with the correct amount of food from your own country, then you have to import it, even during wartime, and that represents a fairly major vulnerability that your opponents will no doubt seek to exploit. Most famously, of course, Germany sought to exploit this problem with the UK in both world wars with the U-boat campaigns, and the amount of effort that was put into keeping the convoys bringing food and other supplies in really shows the kind of additional expense that you have to go to just to keep this, what seems to be a very basic supply issue, from blowing up in your face. So, once you've established for your food, fuel, ammo and spare parts where they're coming from, and if you can supply them in enough numbers, well, let's assume for a moment that you have been able to work all of that out. Whether you've used stockpiles, whether you've developed your own internal industry, etc., but you have the things that you need to supply your navy. Well, this is fantastic, except that most of them don't tend to pop up in dockyards. They tend to pop up in fields, in commercial ports, in industry that is not necessarily near the coast, so you now have to get all of this stuff to your naval dockyards. This is the next step in logistics, transporting everything over land, and for that you need an awful lot of infrastructure. With the sheer amount of supplies that you're talking about, and in a lot of cases the sheer weight of these supplies, road-based transportation just isn't going to cut it. You're either going to have to build a significant coastal infrastructure to carry bulk goods via sea, or, and most often, you're going to have to construct a significant rail network to transport these goods internally and then out to your various naval bases. Of course, back before the invention of the railways, during what's mostly the age of sail, you couldn't do that, and some stuff would have to be transported by road, but an awful lot of things would end up being transported by sea, which represents, obviously, when you're talking about naval warfare, a key vulnerability point that your enemies can attack. This is a relatively underappreciated aspect of naval warfare. For example, whilst the naval aspect of the Crimean War generally often goes relatively unremarked upon, there's an even more niche aspect, especially in the Black Sea region of the conflict, which was that the Russian forces were supplied quite considerably by various food-growing regions in and around the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov, and this was all going fairly well for them right up until the Royal Navy, with some assistance from the French Navy, decided to go raiding and pillaging, one of the things the Royal Navy does best in the Age of Sail, all along the coastline. Suddenly, well, the food supplies and such like were gone, but even the ones that could be grown anew faced significant transportation difficulties, and suddenly the Russian supply line was looking very much like it might be cut. The supplies might be there, but if they're dozens or hundreds of miles away, they're not doing any good for the men on the front line, and suddenly the war looks like it's going to have to wrap up rather quickly. Now, fair enough, this is supplies for a land-based army, not a navy, but the same holds true for naval stores and supplies. If you're sending all this other stuff we've just been discussing via coastal shipping, and the enemy cuts off that coastal shipping, well, your navy isn't going to be any more operational. And even if all your transport infrastructure is in place and well protected, well, these things generally aren't ordered on a just-in-time basis, the way that a lot of things like commercial foodstuffs are ordered these days for civilian use. These have to be ready there in the dockyards when the ships need them. And you're not going to really be ordering up things like, let's say, 400 rounds of 14-inch ammunition just like that. These have to be prepared well in advance, and so when these things arrive at the dockyard, you need to have the storage infrastructure in place to keep them all and maintain them all. And this isn't just a case of piling them up at the dockside, although some supplies can have that done. In the case of perishable items like meat, you need refrigeration. In the case of other perishable items like, say, ammunition, you need a cool, dry, stable environment to store them in, because sticking them in an old leaky warehouse, and well, if you're lucky, that ammunition will just have a very high dud rate. If you're unlucky, part of your naval base is going to disappear in a colossal explosion completely at random. And of course, you can't just pile bags of coal or 55-gallon drums of oil up at the dockside. You need to store considerably more than that, which means either massive tanks, either above or below ground, or massive piles of coal with their own associated, usually miniature railways to get those supplies to the dockyard when the ship is in. This all in turn affects the size of your naval dockyard, and thus the physical footprint that you can occupy becomes a key part of your naval logistics. A naval base that might have been fine back in the 15th or 16th century when you were operating a handful of 500 to 1,000-ton galleons out of it is going to be, shall we say, rather inadequate if a large town has grown up around it and you have no room for expansion, and now you're suddenly expected to be servicing several 20 to 30,000-ton battleships around the time of the First World War. This can also affect the size of the ships you build, because your dry docks and such may not be big enough, but that's actually a separate issue to general naval logistics. That's more about naval construction and maintenance, and that's a subject for another video. So assuming that you have all these supplies, and assuming that you have the ability to transport them all to your naval bases, and assuming that your naval bases are big enough and contain all the appropriate storage infrastructure to keep these supplies ready to go so that your ships can be equipped with them on an as-needed basis, you might think, oh, surely that's the end of it. Oh, no, 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 no. This is just where things start to get interesting, because you see, there are two more major hurdles to overcome. One of which is, if you are a major naval power, chances are you have one or more overseas possessions. And overseas possessions mean, generally, overseas bases, because there are an awful lot of other powers who might want a piece of your far-flung colonial empire, and so you have to maintain naval squadrons out there to provide security. And those squadrons can't really afford to be journeying across half the planet back home every time they need a bit of a top-up. So you're going to have to construct further naval bases all across the world. And those bases are going to need supplying, because whilst there may be some aspects that they can supply themselves, perhaps the area that you're occupying has its own local coal or perhaps nearby oil stations, and obviously food is grown universally, so there may be some basic staples of food that can be produced in that area. It's very unlikely that your various overseas possessions are going to be in the habit of manufacturing large caliber battleship ammunition or turbine machinery replacement parts, or have the infrastructure in place to extract and process large amounts of coal or oil. And so you will need to set up infrastructure supply lines to take all these things from the home country out to this new overseas base. And if you're a particularly large empire, like the French or the British, you're going to need a lot of these overseas bases. Now, this can make your life as a naval power actually somewhat easier in certain respects. For example, if you're the British Empire, and you therefore have these resupply bases scattered all over the planet because you own about a quarter of it, then when it comes to, say, designing your ships, you don't have to design them to be ultra long range with massive fuel bunkers, like, say, the Americans do, because they have to cross the vast swathes of the Pacific with nary a refueling station in sight, because if your ships happen to need fuel, they can just pop in practically anywhere and receive a bit of a top-up to their bunkers. This is great, as long as you can keep all those bases supplied, which needs a lot of shipping, and be intact, because, of course, if you have bases full of ammunition, machinery parts, fuel, etc., that's going to be a very tempting target for enemy shipping to either blow up or seize. After all, whilst, say, the stockpiles of 15-inch ammunition in Singapore might not necessarily avail the Japanese Navy all that much, since they don't have any 15-inch 42 caliber guns in their fleet, that oil that you supplied to Singapore, well, that'll burn just as happily in the Japanese Navy's boilers as it will in your own. Now, of course, convoying all of this out to all your various bases in time of war would be an incredibly complex, expensive, and risky operation, not to mention the fact it would divert massive amounts of shipping. So that's not the kind of activity you really want to be undertaking unless it's absolutely necessary. And so that means that when you're building up these overseas supply bases, you have to ensure that they are very, very, very well stocked so that they can maintain fairly large naval detachments for considerable portions of time and defend themselves from potential enemy intrusion, even if the naval presence might not be physically there at the time the enemy attacks, especially if they've gone off to fight the enemy in slightly nearby but otherwise out of reach locations. So this adds a whole other layer of complexity to your naval logistics, because now not only are you making sure that you can source all your material, not only making sure you can transport all that material to your Navy's home bases, you're also running a major oceanic shipping infrastructure line, which will get all those things to and from the various overseas bases. Now, granted, you might not be doing this entirely with naval-controlled or government-controlled shipping. You might be chartering a large number of commercial ships to do so, but if you are going to take up the commercial shipping option, that requires there to be enough commercial shipping to actually do the job, and for that commercial shipping to be willing to take on the job, and if they're not willing, then you might have to force them to take on the job, and if you're going to force them to take on the job, you better hope they're flying your flag, because if they're being forced into doing the job and they belong to somebody else, then there's going to be a lot of problems. This is why, well, one of the reasons why the British Merchant Marine was so massive. There were issues with other navies, who generally ended up chartering British ships to do this, such as, for example, during the voyage of the Great White Fleet, whilst the original idea was for American merchant shipping to supply the coal and other necessary supplies needed to keep the Great White Fleet mobile as it worked its way around the world, there simply weren't enough American merchant hauliers who were willing to take on the contracts, and since the US government didn't particularly have a mechanism to force them to take on the contracts, it meant that they ended up having to hire large numbers of foreign ships, as say particularly British, in order to keep the Great White Fleet going. Now, you could mitigate this to a certain degree, as mentioned previously, by, say, following American design practice and designing your ships to just be able to go an awful long distance on a full bunker of fuel by making your bunkers exceptionally large, but inevitably you're going to have to refuel at some point, and to be perfectly honest, when your primary operational theatre is the Pacific, that's going to be more often than if you're operating in the North Sea, the Mediterranean, or the Atlantic on a per voyage basis. So with all that said and done, let's assume you are sourcing the food, the fuel, the ammunition, the spare parts. You're processing it all. You're transporting it to your naval bases at home. You're transporting it to your naval bases overseas. You have sufficient shipping to accomplish all of this. You've built up your rail infrastructure. You've built up your warehousing. Everything's fine and dandy. Well, there's still that one other issue, because remember I said there were two. The other issue is that ships can't necessarily always call in at overseas bases, even if you're the British Empire, and especially if you're anybody else in the early 20th century. You are going to face the issue of resupplying ships when they are at sea. This may be simply because there isn't a friendly naval base nearby. It may be because it's not tactically advisable to withdraw your ships to a nearby naval base at the time. They may be, say, shadowing an enemy or guarding against an enemy fleet intrusion, and, well, if the enemy knows that you can only be out there for, say, 30 days, and then you have to go back to base, well, they'll time their offensive to be taking place at the 31st day, when you are guaranteed to not be there. Or worse still, they'll time their offensive to hit you whilst you are refueling and resupplying in dock when you can't move. And of course, if you are on the offensive, then the enemy is very likely to torch their own supplies, and again, you're not really going to be wanting to be sitting there going, well, we're winning this battle, we're winning this invasion, we're providing brilliant cover to our men, and we're really happy with the way the war is going, and now our fleet has to go halfway across the ocean back to our territory to resupply, and then when we come back we find that our troops, bereft of any gunfire support, supply support, or in the case of World War II, carrier-based air support, have now all been driven back into the sea, and we're back to square one. And this, of course, is assuming that all of your own naval bases and supply dumps are remaining intact, which is not necessarily a guarantee, as the Germans would very rapidly find out in World War I when their wonderfully built-up naval base of Tsingtao turned out to last not all that long as a functional and accessible naval base, although it did hold out as a German-held enclave for a little bit longer than you might expect given the odds stacked against them, when it was decided that the Japanese and the British would really rather see a flag that wasn't the German one flying over that port. Likewise, when the Philippines were lost to the United States in the early part of the Japanese campaign in World War II, their primary fleet base for operations in the Western Pacific was gone, the British likewise losing Singapore shortly thereafter. So all of this, of course, meant that resupply at sea by various means had to be enacted. And as far as shipping goes, this resupply at sea force, whether that be the US Sea Lift Command, the Royal Navy's Royal Fleet Auxiliary, or whatever function or name the various other navies similar arms carry, even down to this day, remains a critically underappreciated aspect of naval power projection. And it's not just about having this capability, period, it's about having this capability in significant amounts and in a very well organised fashion. Very, very briefly touching on modern navies, although obviously that is not the focus of this channel, but there is a reason why there are really only two major navies on the planet who are capable of projecting pretty much their entire active force at any given time to any spot on the planet, that being the US Navy and the Royal Navy. And there is a very, very good reason why US Military Sea Lift Command and the Royal Fleet Auxiliary respectively possess about 90% as many hulls as their respective actual combat navies possess major surface combatants. But going back to our main area of study, we've already mentioned the issues that the Great White Fleet faced during peacetime, but if we look at issues faced during wartime, the US Navy, for example, in 1942, was fairly badly hampered in the kinds of forces it could bring to bear against the Japanese, not necessarily because of the attack on Pearl Harbor, although that really didn't help matters, and not by a shortage of fuel or fuel storage facilities, because as we mentioned, the US was pretty much the single biggest oil producer in the early part of the 20th century, and they had more than enough oil infrastructure on the continental United States, and indeed storage tanks at Pearl Harbor, in order to supply their fleet, and they were building more storage tanks at Pearl Harbor to accommodate an even larger fleet. No, the problem was a lack of fast fleet oilers. Indeed, the loss of the USS Neosho during the early part of the Pacific campaign hurt almost as badly as the loss of the USS Lexington. There were a fair number of oil tankers present, but they were already occupied, for the most part, in supplying the various infrastructure needs that allowed the US to have all this fuel in the first place, taking unprocessed oil from the various oil fields to refinery areas, taking refined oil in various forms to storage facilities at naval bases and for obviously civilian use and other military use, and then taking some of that over to Pearl Harbor. But none of this required any particular speed, and so a lot of these tankers were relatively slow. This was not acceptable for fleet support because a slow tanker is a very vulnerable tanker, and that means you have to escort it, but if you have to escort it and the tanker can only make 8 to 10 knots, well, your entire fleet is restricted to 8 to 10 knots, which is a speed not seen since a particularly badly sailing Age of Sail battle fleet, and that doesn't really help you when your enemy is tootling around at 25 plus knots. And so the faster fleet oilers that could at least vaguely keep up with the fleet and could shuttle back and forth to bases like Pearl Harbor in a relatively reasonable time were in exceptionally high demand. And when they didn't exist in particularly large numbers, you physically couldn't supply the forward operating naval forces with, in this particular case, fuel, in anything like the amounts needed to sustain all of the ships that the US, on paper, theoretically had available. And the sheer number of these vessels that are needed really does bear emphasizing, because whilst you have the normal problem that you'd have with any kind of shipping involved in combat operations, which is that at any given point a certain amount of those ships are going to need to be in refit or repair, another amount are either going to be heading in that direction or coming away from there, and that leaves you with a smaller amount, usually between a third up to maybe 50% if you're really lucky, that are actually available from your notional fleet for use at any given time. Each of those vessels are going to be further subdivided between those that are resupplying themselves to take goods or fuel or whatever out to the fleet, those that are on their way to the fleet, those that are supplying the fleet, and those that are heading back to resupply themselves after having delivered those materials to the fleet. And on that loop, that accounts for one theatre of operations. If you're going to run two theatres of operation, then you need two sets of ships that are doing that little supply run. And that's just for one type of supply. In this case, let's say fuel oil. But your ships are also, as we said, going to need ammunition, they're going to need food, and they're going to need various spares and resupplies of items, whether that be float planes, whether that be machinery parts, whether that be general electrical components, tools, or even new crew and other consumables like clothing or letters. And if you're the US Navy, you can't obviously forget the ice cream supplies. If you're the Royal Navy, don't forget the rum and beer. And on top of all of that, you've got to account for the fact that whilst any individual supply vessel may be able to supply multiple ships, for example, a fleet oiler might be able to sustain a dozen destroyers or 2 or 3 battleships, if you've got more than that many destroyers or cruisers or battleships or carriers in your fleet, you're going to need more than one oiler or food store ship or whatever, and every additional ship that you need to supply a fleet at any given time means you have to multiply that up, as we said, by the number that are resupplying and heading to and from, and that in turn expands the overall size of your necessary logistical supply fleet. You can, of course, mitigate this issue somewhat, because you don't want all these vulnerable and numerous supply ships chasing your fleet around in the middle of an active combat theatre if you can avoid it, but it might not be avoidable. But where you can, you try and maybe set up a forward operating base. In World War II, the US Navy had great success with doing this at Ulithi, if that's been pronounced anywhere close to correct. And in locations like this, you could build up stockpiles of material, kind of like a somewhat impromptu forward naval operating base, but at that point, if you're going to build up large stockpiles, you still need this cycle of supply going. And that's not even accounting for combat losses, because of course supply ships are not the world's most well defended of vessels. But let's say for whatever reason you are not able to even get your ships back to a forward resupply base, and you absolutely have to resupply your ships at sea. Well, this is yet another complication in your logistical chain, because it turns out that resupplying ships at sea is a rather difficult thing. When you are trying to offload cargo onto land, that's one thing. Both ship and land tend to, relatively speaking, be fairly stationary. At sea, neither the supply ship nor the ship that is being supplied are going to be stationary in terms of movement, usually. They tend to be, going somewhere. But within that, they also tend to be rolling, pitching, and heaving, and slamming your ships together repeatedly is not a recipe for staying afloat for any particularly great length of time. But if your ships are standing somewhat apart, well, I'd love to see someone chuck a sack of potatoes more than a couple of feet. And whilst I'm sure many of you will probably be thinking, oh, that's fine, I can probably grab one like an Olympic hammer and twirl it around myself and then chuck it a few dozen feet. Yeah, great. You may be able to do that once, maybe twice. But a ship needs an awful lot of potatoes, and I'd love to see you do that on the 30th sack of potatoes in, let's say, 10 minutes. Plus, who exactly gets to be on catching duty? So all of this leads into a resupply at sea scenario where you have to have specialist equipment and specialist training for your ships so that they can quickly and safely resupply your warships. There are certain ways that you can do this that make things somewhat easier. For example, transferring coal is not the easiest of things to do at any time at all. And one technique that was developed, well, in the First World War especially, but somewhat to a certain extent before that, was for colliers and the ships that they were supplying to meet up in a relatively secluded spot that was sheltered, such as, say, a harbour or off a small island, where the ships could actually make themselves stationary, which then it became much easier and safer to pull alongside, and it was therefore much easier to resupply. But this may not always be possible, or indeed desirable, and so mobile resupply at sea was developed as well. The crucible for this turned out largely to be World War II, and largely also the Pacific, because, well, in World War I, the smaller navies had generally lost their overseas bases very quickly and tended not to operate all that much in overseas environments after the first year or two of the war, and the larger navies tended to just use their resupply bases because, well, there wasn't any particularly pressing need to do otherwise. In World War II, however, as we've covered, quite a number of these bases were lost, and the struggle was a lot closer for a lot longer, and this meant that resupply at sea really had to develop into a fine art, and in the vast expanses of the Pacific, this was even more so the case. Initially, a lot of the resupply efforts, especially in the Royal Navy, but also in other navies, pre-war and somewhat in the early part of the war itself, were done fore and aft, i.e. one ship would follow the other. Usually the supply ship would follow the warship. This had certain advantages, but also a lot of disadvantages when it came to the rate of supply that could be given. So, as time went on, the side-by-side method of resupply at sea was worked out, and this advantaged the US Navy quite considerably. The Japanese Navy actually also had a very underappreciated element of resupply at sea, which was one of the reasons they were able to get to Pearl Harbor to conduct the December 7th, 1941 attacks in the first place, because they certainly did not have enough fuel in their tanks when they left Japan for the round trip. But it meant that later in the war, the Royal Navy, when it turned up with the British Pacific Fleet, had to go onto a fairly steep learning curve when it came to elements of resupply at sea, because up until that point, whilst the fighting in the Mediterranean, the Atlantic, the North Sea and the Arctic had been particularly vicious in a lot of cases, none of those waters compared quite in terms of scale with operations in the Pacific, and so generally ships had been able to refuel, restock and resupply from various naval bases, with the occasional resupply at sea that was necessary being able to be done with somewhat suboptimal methods, basically down to the rarity of it. And all of this means that you not only have your combat ships and their skill and experience to maintain, but once a war is over, or before a war has begun, you also have to maintain the skills, fleet and technology level of an entirely different branch of non-combat but equally vital elements of your navy. Because these kinds of skills are not easily learned, they're not quickly learned, and if you get rid of them, they tend to disappear very fast. Additionally, as the technology that your navy uses on its frontline combat ships improves, so too does the technology on your supply fleet have to improve. After all, in World War I, having a fleet of colliers is fantastic. In World War II, when almost everything's running on oil, not so much. Now you really do need the oilers, and so on and so forth. So, assuming that you can source all your food, fuel, ammunition and spare parts, process them, transport them to your naval bases, stock up your ships, send them out, transport other supplies to overseas naval bases, and get that supply chain running, and have an entire logistical support element to your fleet in order to resupply it at sea, resupply your overseas bases, and keep your fleet up and running. Well, with all of that done, you now have a navy that can actually fight. So now all you've got to do, after all that expenditure of effort and time and resources, And now you can worry about the shooting and the explosions and the sinking, hopefully, of the other side and so forth. So better hope they make all of that logistical effort worth it. So I hope that's given you a little bit more of an understanding into the wide world of naval logistics. Obviously, almost any individual one of those items could have its own hour-plus video, and indeed at some point next year we will be doing an entire video dedicated purely to resupply at sea, because that's a fascinating and very complicated topic. And while some of you might think, well, come on, Drac, this is almost an hour on logistics, surely that's covered an awful lot. Don't you believe it. Let's put it this way. I have seen some of the documentation that is necessary for even one element of the Royal Fleet Auxiliaries resupply efforts. Not even everything, not even food, fuel, ammunition, etc. This is just one aspect of it. And that pile of documentation that's necessary to keep that element of the RFA operational, that's not even can beat a man to death with the instructions. That's stand a man next to the pile of instructions, jolt the ship slightly, and you'll probably kill him just by having that pile fall on him. So suffice to say that there can be an awful lot more said for logistics. But I think that's enough for now, and once again, thank you very much for listening, and hope to see you again in another video.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.